So today I'm going to be walking through how to make this fully reversible waistcoat dress. I've tried to keep everything as beginner friendly as possible, and I've made the pattern available on my Etsy, which is linked down below. So let's get on with the tutorial. So this is everything that you're going to need for this project. You will need 2 different colours or patterns in your fabric. I would recommend trying to get 2 fabrics that are a similar composition, if not exactly the same. So I'm using a linen, this is from Grid Fabrics, and a linen look cotton, this is from Minerva. You will also need some lightweight fusible interfacing. The fusible interfacing is the one that has glue on one side. You will need some pins, some buttons, some tailor's chalk or a fabric pen, some fabric scissors. For your buttonholes, you will need your buttonhole foot for your machine and a seam ripper, some matching thread, an iron, and I'm going to be using a ruler just to draw in my darts, but you can also just use anything with a straight edge. You could use a book or anything similar to that. In terms of my sewing machines, I'm just going to be using one sewing machine, which is my standard regular machine that has a straight stitch, and I'm just going to be using the Singer Heavy Duty for that, which I would highly recommend. So the pattern that I'm going to be using for this project is my tailor pattern. I only named that because I used this particular pattern to make my Eras Tour outfit. So this one has 3 pattern pieces. So firstly I have pattern piece 1, which is the front of the dress, and then pattern piece 2, which is the back of the dress, and then finally pattern piece 3, which is just used for cutting out your interfacing. So now I'm going to start to walk through how to cut your pieces out. I'm going to do it on the pink colour just because I think it'll be a little bit easier to see. So the first thing that you want to do is to find the selvage edge of your fabric, and you will find 2 of these, and this is the bound edge of your fabric, which prevents it from fraying, whereas you'll find that these edges on the side fray a lot more easily than the selvage edge. So you want to find your 2 selvage edges, lay them one on top of the other, and then you will want a selvage edge at the top and a fold down at the bottom. So you're folding your fabric so that the 2 selvage edges lay on top of each other. So I'm going to start with pattern piece 1, which is the front of the dress, and you should see a line here that says grain line. It's just got an arrow pointing this way, and you want that to be parallel to the selvage edge. So if you want to be really precise with that, you can take your tape measure and just measure either end to check that it's the same distance away from that selvage edge. So that's about right. So I'm just going to draw around that piece. I'm going to use some pattern weights to hold it in place, but you can just use anything that you've got. Just move it up a little bit so you can see the whole piece. I'm just going to draw it in place. I'm going to use this fabric pen, which is water soluble. Normally I would use tailor's chalk, but I want you to be able to see what I'm doing a bit better. So just tracing around the edge of that. So then once you've got that drawn in place, I'm just going to take some pins and pin within those lines, just to make sure that when I start to cut it out, the 2 pieces will stay together. Make sure that the piece you're cutting out will be a lot more precise. So that's how that will be looking. So now you can either cut that piece out, or I'm just going to move on to draw my other piece out as well. Since that's pinned in place, it should be okay. So I'm just moving that up, and hopefully now you can see this fold at the bottom. I'm going to grab my other pattern piece. And for this one, you have another grain line, but that is also the area that wants to be up to the fold. So you can just line that up like this. And then again, you're just going to draw around that piece. So hopefully you can just about see that that piece is drawn out. I'm just going to go in with my pins again and do the same as I did with the front piece. So now I'm just going to go in with my scissors and cut those 2 pieces out, just being very careful to make sure I get both layers of fabric as I'm cutting. So this is how your pieces should look once you've finished cutting them out. So I've got 2 layers in pattern piece 1, which is the front of my dress, and then I've just got one piece in pattern piece 2, obviously it has 2 layers, but that's because it's been cut on the fold. So I'm just going to go and take all of these pins out, and I'm going to press this fold so that it's not super obvious. And then you need to go in and repeat all of those same steps for your second fabric, just so that you've got every piece that you've got here in both fabrics. So I've just finished cutting all of my other pieces out in my other fabric. So I've got 2 for the front and 1 for the back, exactly the same as my pink pieces. And now the only other things that I need to cut out are the pieces for the interfacing, which is pattern piece 3. So here I've just got my interfacing and my pattern piece 3. So you're going to need 4 pieces in total of pattern piece 3, 2 in this direction, and then you'll have to flip it for 2 in the other direction, because this interfacing is going to be used to reinforce your buttons, and obviously you will need one for both sides of the waistcoat. So you need to make sure that you draw one like this and one like this. You should be able to see on your interfacing that one side is kind of shiny, and that is the side of your glue. So if you don't cut them out in opposite directions like this, all of your pieces will have glue on the same side, and then you won't be able to do them facing each other like you need to. So I'm going to go ahead and cut my 4 pieces of my interfacing out. So now that you've got those pieces of interfacing cut out, I'm going to start to add them to the front of my dress. So I've got my 2 pieces in pattern 1 in my pink fabric. And I like to lay them out like this because it just means that you can constantly check that you're going to have one for each side. And that's important with adding this interfacing. I'm just going to line it up to that straight edge down the middle. You want to make sure that you're doing that with the shiny glue side facing towards the fabric. And if your fabric has a right or wrong side, you want to add this to the wrong side. My pink fabric doesn't have a right or wrong side, but my patterned fabric does. And then once you've got that lined up, though it doesn't need to be perfect, you can start to press that in place. So I'm just going to use my iron to press that interfacing in place. Normally find it easier to just press and hold rather than kind of like swiping up and down. Depending on your fabric, this will take a different amount of time. There are some fabrics that just have a texture that don't take to fusible interfacing that well, so you will have to hold your iron on for a bit longer for those. So I'm just going to carry on doing this until the whole piece is glued in place, and then I'm going to do the same thing for my other 2 front pieces in my other fabric. So once you've got the interfacing added to all of your front pieces, you want to start to add a button guide down the front. So I do have a button guide on the pattern, so you can use that if you want to, or you can decide to freehand it or do it however you want to. And there's a few different methods you can use to transfer this guide onto your pattern piece. For me, all I'm going to do is just pull this back slightly, and I know that this button guide is about 3 centimeters away from the edge, so I'm going to measure 3 centimeters from the edge of the fabric to the pattern, just so that I know that this line here is 30 centimeters away from the edge of the fabric, the same way that this edge of the pattern is 3 centimeters away from the button guide. I'm just going to measure down here as well. And that's 3 centimeters as well. And then I'm just going to take a ruler so that I can make sure I'm in line with each of those guides. I'm just going to put a small mark for each one. Like I said, you can do this however you like. You might have your own way that you prefer to mark a button guide, but you also might just decide that you don't want to use this guide at all and you want to come up with your own spacing, which is absolutely fine as well. So hopefully you can just about see where that guide is. Just zoom in slightly. So you've got your button guide on the right side of the fabric, and then on the wrong side you will have the interface in. So I'm going to go in and repeat that for all the rest of these pieces. So at this stage, you should have 4 pieces for pattern piece 1, 2 in one fabric and 2 in the other, all with the button guides marked onto the right side of the fabric and the interface impressed onto the wrong side of the fabric. So at this point, you want to start to add your darts. So these darts are just going to be added to create more shape in this piece. So you've got 1 dart in the shoulder and 1 dart in the waist. And as with the button guide, there are plenty of different ways that you can mark these lines onto your fabric pieces. I'm going to show you my favourite way to mark the darts on, but you can do it in whatever your favourite way is. So I'm going to start with one of the pieces of my pink fabric, and you want this to be the wrong side facing up. So this is the side with my interface in. I'm going to start by drawing in the shoulder dart, and I'm just going to line that up with the fabric piece, and I'm going to take my tailor's chalk, and first off I'm just going to pull this down slightly so that I can mark where these 2 lines end. Just using some pink tailor's chalk for that. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. And then for this point down here, I'm just going to pull this back up so it's all lining up. I'm just going to take this tool here, you can use anything that you've got that's got a sharp point, and just poke through where that point ends. And then again, taking my tailor's chalk and just marking that in place. I'll just zoom in slightly so that you can see that a bit better. I'm just going to darken those points as well. So I've got all 3 of those points marked in place. I'm just going to take my ruler. Like I said earlier in the video, you can just use anything with a straight edge for this. And I'm going to match up those marks, just making sure that you're doing this on the wrong side of your fabric. And that is your first dart all marked in place. Now I'm going to move on to adding the waist dart. So now I'm going to be working with this dart here, and I'm going to do it in exactly the same way. So for each of these points, I'm just going to punch a hole through the paper so that I can easily mark it in place. And then marking that with my tailor's chalk again. So I've got 1 at either end and then 2 for the centre here. And then again, I'm just going to line them up. I'm just going to draw a line straight down the centre first, because this can help when you start to pin the darts in place. But you don't have to do this, this is optional. And then fill in the rest of those lines. Looking to create a kind of diamond shape. And then again, you don't need to do this, but I'm just going to draw a line in the centre as well. And I'm actually going to draw a line up the centre of this dart as well. I'm just going to measure both sides to see if it's about central, and it is. So now that the darts are drawn in place, you want to start to construct them. So I'm going to start with this shoulder dart. Your goal here is to fold the dart with right sides facing together so that these outer lines match up. So I'm just going to match them as best as I can and start to fold that piece. I'm going to place a pin through that line that we've drawn, and your goal is to make it so that the pin goes through the line on this side, but it also goes through the pin on that side. So I've done that perfectly first try, but that's quite often not the case. You will quite often have to readjust. And then I'm also just going to place a pin down at where that dart ends down here. Just going to carry on working my way down those lines with my pins. And again, that just happens to be perfect, but it is quite rare that I tend to do that first try. Normally I do have to move things around a bit. And again, that one has gone surprisingly well. So once you've got those pins in place and everything is nicely lined up, I'm just going to sew along that line with a straight stitch. So I'm going to start at the top here, reverse up here, work my way down, and then I'm not going to reverse at the bottom. I'm just going to tie it off, but I will show you that on my machine. So I've got my machine set up to a straight stitch. I'm just going to take out that first pin and line up this line that we've drawn with the needle and just sew along here. I'm going to reverse at the top. And just take your time to make sure you're staying with that line. Just take out the next pin. And then just take out that final pin. And I'm just going to sew straight off. I'm not going to reverse or anything. So then I'm just going to take these threads at the bottom of that dart and just tie it in a double knot. And trim off the excess. So this is how my shoulder dart is looking. The only other thing I'm going to do is to just cut off some of this excess. So I'm just going to trim along here, just leaving about 1 centimetre of seam allowance. And then that's the shoulder dart done, and I can move on to the waist dart. And it's pretty much exactly the same process, it's just a different shaped dart. So again, I'm going to be folding it with right sides facing together. And I'm going to start by pinning those end points in place. This one might be a little bit trickier to make out on the video because it is quite a thin dart. And then again, I'm just going to make my way along these lines and just constantly check in at the other side to make sure everything is lined up. So that one is perfect. So once I've got all of those pins in place and it's all lined up with the other side, I'm going to go in and sew that dart similar to how I did with the shoulder dart. But this time I'm going to start in the center here and I'm going to come all the way down here. And again, I'm going to tie it off at this end, but I'm also going to tie it off at the start and then do the same on this side. And that's all going to be with a straight stitch again. So again, I've set my machine up to a straight stitch and I'm just going to start at the center here. And just follow that line down. Again, not reversing on this one at all. going to sew straight off again. I'm going to save tying them off until I've finished sewing both sides. I've just switched the pins over to this side so it's slightly easier for me to remove them as I go. I'm just going to start in the centre again. I'm going to remove that first pin. And again, just sewing off at the bottom. So once you've got that dart sewed in place, I'm just going to start to tie off some of these threads. So you should have 2 threads here from each of those lines. And I'm just going to tie a double knot there. And you'll have exactly the same on the other side as well. So I'm going to do the same there. You can just trim those off. And then you should have 2 threads at either end. You can just do the same with them, just tying them into a double knot. So then once you've finished tying off those threads, the darts are very nearly done. I'm just going to fold it over to the right side and I'm going to press those darts flat. So once you've got to this stage, this piece is done and you just want to repeat that process for all of your other pieces for pattern piece 1, which is the front of your dress. So once you've got those front darts in place on all 4 of your pieces, you can move on to the back of the dress. And this also has a waist dart, but it doesn't have one on the shoulder. So you want to go in and add these in exactly the same way as you did on the front. The only thing that's going to be slightly different is obviously this piece has been cut out on a fold. So you'll draw the dart in here and then you'll flip the piece and draw another one on the other side. Just try and show you on the actual piece. So I've just got the back of my pink piece here. So you would take your sharp tool and press all those points in place. And again, just draw each of those points in place and then flip it and do exactly the same thing. And you'll already have these marks poked in place to add them onto the other side. Just always make sure that you're lining up these edges for whichever side you're doing. But other than that, it is exactly the same steps as the front piece. So those back darts should look something like this. As with the front, make sure that they're drawn onto the wrong side of your fabric. And then you can just go ahead and follow the same steps that you did with the waist darts for the front, just pinning them in place and sewing along these lines. So this is how the back piece should look with those darts in place, and I've pressed them as I did with the front as well. And obviously now you would just go in and repeat for your other back piece. And once all of those darts are in place, I'm going to go back to working on the front. So I'm going to take my pink piece for the front. I'm just going to take my piece in the other fabric and lay it on top of the pink one with right sides facing together. Start to match up those corresponding edges. I'm just going to pin this in place. So I'm going to pin along the front edge here, around the neckline, around the armhole, and then along the bottom edge. So I'm going to be missing out the side seam here and the top of the strap. So once you've added your pins, it should look something like this. So now I'm going to sew each of those edges in place. So I'm going to go along the bottom edge, along the front, around the neckline and around the armhole, just leaving the top of the strap and the side seam open. So for that, I'm going to use a 1 centimeter seam allowance and I'm going to use a straight stitch. So I'm just going to start with that bottom edge and just start to follow it around. Just reversing at the start. And just as I get to the corners, I'm going to turn my needle, do 1 stitch diagonal to that corner, and then carry on. That's just going to make it so that your corners are a bit sharper. I'm going to do the same at this corner. I'm just rotating, doing 1 stitch, and then coming the rest of the way around. And just reversing at the top here. And then I'm just going to finish off by doing the armhole as well. So once those seams are in place, I'm just going to take my scissors and cut some triangles around the curved edges and around some of the corners. This is just going to make sure that the corners are nice and sharp and that the curves keep their curve when you turn this to the right side out. Just being very careful to make sure that you're not cutting through that stitch line. Just zoomed in a bit so you can see a bit easier what I'm doing. And then when it comes to the corners, I'm literally just going to chop across them like that. Just take off that excess and it'll make them a little bit sharper when we turn this to the right side out. I'm going to do the same at the bottom here. So once you get to this stage, you just want to turn this piece to the right side out. And then I'm just going to press this to make it sit nice and flat. So now that I've pressed that in place, this piece is done for now. So you can go ahead and repeat all of these same steps for your remaining pieces. And now I'm going to move on to the back. So for your back piece, this is going to be almost exactly the same process as what you've just done. So I'm going to take the back piece in pink and lay that with the right side facing up. And then grab my other back piece and lay that with right sides facing together with the pink one. And just match up those corresponding edges. And then just as you did with the front, I'm going to take some pins, pin along that bottom edge, around the armholes, and then around the back of the neckline here. So once those pins are in place, I'm just going to go and sew around each of those edges. So around the armhole, back of the neckline, other armhole, and then along that bottom edge. Just as with the front pieces, I'm going to be leaving open the side seams and the top of the straps. So I'm going to do that all with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a straight stitch. I'm going to do that off camera just because you've already seen me do it with the front pieces. So once those seams are sewn in place, I'm just going to go in and do the same thing that I did with the front and just cut some triangles around the curved edges. So that's going to be around both armholes and around the back of the neckline. And then I'm also going to do any obvious corners as well. So once you've finished cutting those triangles in place and any corners, you can start to attach the front and the back together. So the back wants to stay inside out for this, and your two front pieces should be the right way out. So basically what we're going to do with these front pieces is we're going to put them inside the back pieces, but they're going to match up like this. So we're going to pin this strap inside the strap of the back piece, and the same with the side seam, and I'm going to do that on both sides. So it's going to look something like this, but of course these pieces are going to be inside the back piece. So I'll start with this one. And something that's very important to consider is you want the same fabrics to be facing each other. So I've got my checked fabric here, and that wants to be facing the checked fabric that I've got in the inside here. So I'm going to start with the strap and just place that up inside here. Making sure nothing's twisted, and then I'm going to pin that in place. So you've got pink facing pink there and checked facing checked on the other side. And then I'm going to do exactly the same with this side seam. So just tucking it into there and starting to pin that in place. I like to do the two most extreme points first. And then I'm going to pin the rest of the way along there. So once you've got those edges pinned in place, you just want to repeat exactly the same thing for your other piece. Just all of the same steps to get that pinned inside the back piece. So now that those front pieces are in place inside of the back piece, I'm just going to go in and sew along those four edges. So both of the side seams and the top of the straps, just being very, very careful to make sure that you get all 4 layers of fabric in each of those areas. And I'm going to be using a 1 centimetre seam allowance again and a straight stitch. So I'm just going to start at one of those side seams and just follow it along. I'm just going to reverse at the top. And then I'm just going to reverse at this end as well. And then I'm just going to repeat those same steps for the other side seam and the 2 straps as well. And once those seams are also in place, everything will be completely enclosed. So your 2 front pieces will be completely enclosed within the back piece. So now we need to turn this to the right side out. So I'm just going to unpick a small section along this bottom edge, and I'm going to use that to turn this to the right side out. So once you have that hole in place, I would recommend just reinforcing on either side of the hole for your stitch line, just to make sure that none of the rest of this comes undone. And then I'm just going to use that hole to pull through the dress to the right side. So this is the stage that you should be at now. You've got your dress turned to the right side out, and the next step is going to be to close up this hole that we made at the bottom, wherever it is, over here. This hole, we want to close this up as the next step. But before you do that, I would highly recommend trying this on first, because while you've got that hole still open, you can easily go in and make adjustments if you need to, especially if you needed to take in the sides, for example. You won't likely be able to add any material at this stage, but you can definitely take it out. So before you do anything else, just go and give this a try on. So once you've tried this on, you can start to close up this hole. This is actually optional. If you want to, you can skip this part and just close it up when we do the top stitch in the next step. But I find it easier to close this hole up first. So I'm just going to use a ladder stitch to do this, which is a hand stitch. So I'm just going to go in one side for one stitch and then come over to the other side, keeping it as parallel as possible. It's a very simple stitch, and you're just going to do that along the whole length of that hole. Zoom in slightly. So just coming over to that green side for one stitch, and then over to the pink. And then back to the green. I'm just going to keep doing that until I've come all the way along that hole. So once you've closed up that bottom edge, I'm just going to add a top stitch. So a top stitch is just a stitch that's going to finish off the right side of your fabric. And with reversible clothing, it helps to keep everything nice and flat. You don't have to add a top stitch, it's completely optional, but I personally prefer the way that it looks with a top stitch. So for my top stitch, you don't have to do it in exactly the same way that I'm doing, but I'm going to just follow along all of those external edges just with a straight stitch. So I'm going to come along this neckline, straight down the front, around that bottom edge, and straight back up this other side and around that neckline. And then I'm also going to come around the armhole. So I'm just going to start at the back of that neckline, and I'm going to follow around that edge just with a straight stitch. Now I'm just coming into that neckline. And then down into the front. And now along that bottom edge. And I'm just coming to that area where I did my ladder stitch. So if you didn't do the ladder stitch, you can just fold this edge in on itself and sew straight over the top of it. And now I'm just going back up the other side. So this is where the buttons are going to go. And then I'm just coming up to the neckline, and I'm going to match that up to where I started. I'm just going to reverse to secure that stitch. And now I'm just going to repeat that for my two armholes. So once you've got that top stitch in place, it should look something like this. And now the only other steps left are to add the buttons and the buttonholes. So I've already got my button guide down the front, and I'm going to start by adding my buttonholes. So firstly, you need to mark on where you're going to sew for these buttonholes. I'm using buttons of about 1.5 centimetre wide. I don't think I'm going to use this exact colour, but I've not decided yet. So if they change, that will be why. And I'm just going to place it over the top of one of those marks that I've left for my button guide. And I'm going to draw either side so I know how wide it is, and then just fill in the gap. I'm going to do that all the way down. Obviously, you can decide which side you'd like your buttonholes to be and which side you want your buttons to be, but obviously when you flip it to the other side, that will change anyway, so it doesn't overly matter. So I'm just placing that onto that button guide. I'll just zoom in a little bit. Do the line on either side so we know how wide it is. And then that line in between. So I'm just going to carry on doing that all the way down the dress. So once I've got all of those buttonholes drawn, I can take them over to my machine and start to sew them in. So this is the setting that I'm going to be using on my machine. So I'm going to start with this one, and this will do either end. And then I'm going to switch to this one to go down the side, come back to this one to do the bottom, and then come over to this one to do up the left side. So you're going to start here, twist this way, and then finally twist to here to finish off. So I've got my buttonhole foot in place already. I've already done a couple of my buttonholes just to check that the settings were all correct. If you've never done buttonholes before, I would highly recommend having a practice on some scrap fabric before going in and doing it on your final piece. So I'm just going to take my fabric and put it underneath my guide. And then I just like to use the hand wheel to check that I'm in the right place. And once you're happy with that positioning, I'm going to start by doing that end section. And then switching over to come down the right side. And then doing that bottom section. And then coming back up the left side. And that's all there is to it for the time being. So I'm just going to carry on and do the rest of my buttonholes, and then I'll show you the next steps. One last tip to mention is that you should be able to see that I've got two different colour threads here. So I've got one colour threaded through the top, which matches my pink fabric, and then I've got a dark pink that's going to go better with the other side. Just make sure that those buttonholes blend a bit more nicely with each side. So now the next step is just going to be to rip down the centre of those buttonholes. I'm going to use a seam ripper to do that. And one tip I would recommend is to just put a pin through the end of that buttonhole. Just make sure that you don't go too far, which can be quite easy. Just zoom in a little bit more. And then once you've got that pin in place, I'm just going to take that seam ripper and rip up the centre. Just doing that nice and carefully. Just like that. And then I just like to trim off any of the loose threads. And then this is optional, but I just like to use a bit of fray check just to clean them up a bit, but you don't need to do this. They will be fine as they are. I'm just going to do that on both sides. I'm going to let that dry, and I'm just going to continue ripping the rest of my buttonholes open. So once you've got those buttonholes in place, the only thing left to do is to add your buttons. So obviously you're going to be adding a button to both sides, one on this side and one on this side. And it's going to depend largely on what kind of buttons you're using with what kind of instructions you follow here. I'm going to show you exactly how I'm going to add my buttons, but there isn't really a wrong way to do this. The only big thing that you need to make sure is that your buttons aren't sitting completely flat to the dress, because otherwise they just won't go through the buttonholes, especially when you've got a button on the other side. So I'll show you how I avoid having them sit too flat to the fabric. I would also recommend adding them one at a time rather than adding them both at the same time. But because I'm going to be using clear buttons for this side, I am going to add them both at the same time, just so that I can hide some of the threads under this button. But generally I would recommend sewing them on one at a time, just purely so that you can control exactly where each one is going to sit, because it can be quite difficult when you do both of them at the same time. But I will show you how I'm going to add them both at the same time in case you do want to do it like that. But if you do want to see exactly how I would add them one at a time, you can go and have a look at my Bonnie video. I show exactly how to do it in that. I'll try and remember to link it down below. So I've got my needle threaded up here, and then I've just got a knot tied at the end. So I'm just going to start by finding one of the marks that we left earlier and just putting a couple of stitches through there. And then I'm going to thread my first button onto there. And then go through to the other side. And then I'm going to take that second button and thread that on as well. And then just try and go through both of those holes on the way back. And I'm just going to keep going back and forward, trying to get through both holes. So you want to make sure that this isn't too tight to the fabric, like I was saying. So don't pull it too tight, and I like to just keep going in and loosen it just a touch. Just keep going until you think that's nice and secure. And then once you're happy with it, I'm just going to come through once more to that pink side so that you can't see too much of the threads with the clear side. I'm just going to loosen that a bit more. And then I'm just going to try and come through one of those holes and straight out. Again, I'm just going to loosen it a bit more. And then I'm going to take my thread and just wrap it around the button. This, I would say, is arguably the most important part because it stops the button from sitting flat to the fabric. Hopefully you can just about see that. And then I'm going to take my needle, come through to the other side and do the same thing. Just trying to keep close to the center of that button so that you can't see too much of the threads. And then I'm just going to come back through to the pink side actually so that I can tie it off. So just going under that button and then passing the needle through the loop. I'm just going to do that a couple more times until it feels nice and secure. And that is pretty much it. So once you've cut off those threads, that first button is finished, and I'm just going to go in and finish the rest of the buttons off camera, and then the dress will be finished.